In the digital age, the perfect family is a performance. We curate our lives, filtering out the arguments, the debts, and the disappointments. We post the smiles, the vacations, the declarations of love. We build a facade not just for the world, but for ourselves. And in the summer of 2018, no one performed the role of a perfect family man better than Chris Watts. My name is Dr. Alana Vega, and in my work analyzing digital age crimes, I have come to understand the dangerous power of the rules we create for ourselves. The story of the Watts family is a terrifying case study in what happens when the most important rule becomes maintaining a perfect picture at any cost. To the millions who saw their lives on Facebook, the Watts family of Frederick, Colorado had it all. Shanann Watts, vibrant, ambitious, and pregnant with their third child, was a master of this performance. Her social media was a sun-drenched gallery of domestic bliss. Videos of her two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, singing to their father. Gushing posts about Chris, the quiet, doting, handsome dad who was her rock. He was the shy counterpart to her outgoing personality, the calm anchor in their picture-perfect life. But on the morning of August 13th, the performance abruptly stopped. Shanann, along with 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, vanished. A frantic friend, unable to contact Shanann after dropping her home from a business trip, called the police. When officers arrived at the pristine suburban home, they found only Chris Watts. He was calm, concerned, and seemingly as baffled as they were. His family, he said, had simply disappeared. In the hours that followed, the story exploded. A local news crew arrived, and Chris Watts agreed to an on-camera interview, a plea for his family's safe return. He stood on his front porch, the very stage for his family's perfect life, and spoke to the cameras. He said all the right words. Chris Watts, voice flat, unemotional from archive footage. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, just come back. If somebody has her, just please bring her back. I need to see everybody. This house is not complete without everybody here. He looked directly into the camera, trying to project the image of a heartbroken husband and father. The nation saw a man in agony, but a handful of seasoned investigators watching that same broadcast saw something else entirely. They didn't see grief in his eyes. They saw a disturbing, chilling emptiness. They saw a man not pleading but reciting a script. They saw a crack in the perfect facade. They saw a mask. The man on that porch was the first and most critical piece of evidence. To understand the crime, investigators first had to deconstruct the performance. They had to look past the pleading husband on the television screen and dive into the digital fortress he and his wife had so carefully constructed. Shanann Watts' Facebook page was not just a collection of memories. It was a meticulously curated public relations campaign for her family, and Chris was its silent, smiling star. For years, she had broadcast their lives, turning everyday moments into content for her multi-level marketing business Thrive. The videos are a sun-drenched gallery of manufactured bliss. Here is Chris, patiently letting his daughters paint his fingernails. Here he is, receiving a surprise pregnancy announcement, his face a perfect picture of delighted shock. And here he is in dozens of posts being lauded by his wife, Shanann's voice, upbeat from a Facebook video. I'm so grateful for this man. He works so hard for his family. He's the best dad these girls could ever ask for. He is my rock. This wasn't just a happy family. It was a brand. And the brand was built on a single, powerful, and deeply modern social contract. It's the first and most important rule in understanding this case. A rule so pervasive in our culture that we often don't even see it. I call it the rule of the perfect family. This rule dictates that success and happiness are not just to be experienced, but to be performed, documented, and broadcast. It's a silent competition for the most flawless life, played out on the public stage of social media. The Watts family were not just participants in this competition. They were champions. Their life, as presented online, was an impenetrable fortress of joy, success, and mutual adoration. Chris was not the architect of this fortress, but he was its most important pillar. His quiet, agreeable nature made him the perfect canvas onto which Shanann, and the thousands who followed her, could project the image of the ideal husband and father. He played his part perfectly, smiling on cue, holding his daughters, and providing the silent, steady presence her narrative required. He was a supporting actor in the movie of his own family's life, a role he seemed to accept without question. The online evidence was overwhelming. By all digital accounts, this was a man deeply in love with his wife and devoted to his children. The idea that he could be responsible for their disappearance seemed, to the outside world, as impossible as the idea that the sun would rise in the west. The digital fortress was, on the surface, impenetrable, but every fortress has a crack. And in the days following the disappearance, as investigators gained access to Shanann's phone, they found it. The crack was not in the public performance. It was in the private, terrified whispers. While on that final business trip to Arizona, just 2 days before she vanished, Shanann had been sending a series of increasingly desperate text messages to a close friend. The sun-drenched posts on Facebook were a lie. Behind the scenes, her perfect world was collapsing. Shanann's voice, as if from a text message, her tone now quiet, anxious, and utterly different. "He's changed, Nicole. Something is cold in his eyes. He told me he doesn't want the baby. He said we're not compatible anymore, that he doesn't feel the same." Friend's voice responding text. "What? After all these years? Where is this coming from?" Shanann's voice text. "I don't know. It's like I'm living with a stranger. I'm so scared. I have to face him when I get home tonight." The perfect family, the digital fortress of happiness, was a lie. In the real world, away from the cameras and the hashtags, the marriage was dying. What could have happened in just a few short weeks to cause such a catastrophic collapse in a seemingly perfect relationship? And what darkness was Chris Watts hiding behind the empty smile he showed the world? Those text messages were the first crack of thunder in a gathering storm. For the investigators on the ground, the case shifted in an instant. This was no longer just a missing persons case. It was now a potential homicide, and the man giving tearful interviews on his front porch had just become their primary suspect. The entire investigation pivoted, focusing its unblinking eye on Chris Watts. In his initial interviews at the police station, Chris continued the performance. He was the picture of a concerned, cooperative husband. He answered their questions calmly, his story consistent but troublingly vague. He described an emotional conversation with Shanann, suggesting she had taken the children and left, perhaps to a friend's house. But his narrative was a hollow script, devoid of the one thing investigators expect from a grieving husband: genuine emotion. There was no panic, no rage, no desperation. There was only a strange, placid emptiness. His story had holes, but his demeanor was a stone wall. The police knew he was lying. But knowing and proving are two different things. Without a body, without a crime scene, without a confession, they were at an impasse. The investigation could have stalled right there, lost in a frustrating he said, she said. But then came a breakthrough. Not from a detective's hunch, but from the quiet, digital gaze of a neighbor's security camera. Nate Trinastic, who lived across the street, had noticed the media circus and approached the police. He mentioned he had a surveillance camera pointed directly at the Watts' driveway. It was a long shot, but it was the only objective witness they had. The lead investigator, along with a visibly nervous Chris Watts, went over to Nate's house to review the footage from that fateful morning. The scene that unfolded in Nate's living room was a masterclass in psychological tension. The three men gathered around the television, watching the grainy black and white recording of the pre-dawn hours. The footage showed Shanann's car in the driveway. It showed Chris's truck. And then, it showed Chris moving back and forth from the garage to the truck, his movements purposeful, deliberate. He was loading things into the cab. The shapes were indistinct, but he was clearly not just heading off to work. The mask of the calm, cooperative husband began to melt under the heat of objective proof. The police body cam footage from that moment is a stunning portrait of a liar being confronted with a truth he cannot spin. Chris's body language shifted dramatically. He began to fidget, to rub his hands together, his breathing becoming shallow. Police officer, voice calm, pointed. "What time did you leave this morning, Chris?" Chris Watts, voice suddenly higher, nervous. About 5:15, 5:27. Nate, the neighbor watching the screen. "You see him? He's loading stuff. He's loading stuff in there." Chris Watts, stuttering, looking at the floor. "Yeah, I was loading my tools. My lunchbox?" His explanation was weak, unconvincing. He knew it, the police knew it. And most importantly, he knew that they knew. The neighbor's camera had shattered his narrative. It provided a single, undeniable fact. Chris Watts was the last person to be at that house, engaging in suspicious activity at the very time his family disappeared. The camera footage, while damning, was not a smoking gun. It showed suspicious activity, but it did not show a body or a crime. It was a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence, but the police needed more. They needed to break him. They needed a confession. They decided to deploy a tool designed to bypass the lies of a performer and measure the truth pulsing in his veins. They asked Chris to take a polygraph test. In a final spectacular act of narcissistic arrogance, Chris agreed without hesitation. He had spent his entire life performing, crafting a believable facade for the world. He believed his mastery of deception was so complete, his control over his own emotions so absolute, that he could fool not just his friends, not just the police, but the very machine designed to detect a lie. He was about to place a bet on his own perfect mask. It was a bet he would catastrophically lose. The polygraph room is a place designed to strip away performance. It is small, sterile, and silent. There is no audience to charm, no social cues to read. There is only you, the examiner, and a machine that translates the body's hidden betrayals. A spike in heart rate, a drop of sweat, a catch of the breath, into the stark, binary language of truth and lies. For Chris Watts, a man whose entire life had become a stage, this was the one room where his acting skills were utterly useless. He walked in with a quiet confidence, the same placid demeanor he had shown the television cameras. The examiner, a calm, methodical agent from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, began the process. He explained how the machine worked. He attached the sensors to Chris's chest, his arm, his fingertips. Each connection was another layer of his physical autonomy being surrendered to the machine. The test began with simple, baseline questions designed to establish a normal physiological response. Polygraph examiner, voice calm, neutral. Is your name Christopher Watts? Chris Watts, voice steady. Yes. Polygraph examiner, do you live in Frederick, Colorado? Chris Watts, yes, he was passing. His body was calm. The needles on the machine traced steady, even lines. He was in control. Then, the examiner seamlessly transitioned to the questions that mattered, the ones that probed the dark, hollow space behind his eyes. Polygraph examiner, are you trying to delay the discovery of the bodies of your family? Chris Watts, no. On the machine, a needle jumped, a small, violent tremor in the otherwise calm reading. Polygraph examiner, do you know where your daughter Bella is? Chris Watts, no, another spike, sharper this time. His body was screaming a truth his mouth was denying. The examiner pressed on, his voice never changing, a relentless, monotone instrument of pressure. Polygraph examiner, did you do something to Shanann that caused her disappearance? Chris Watts, a slight hesitation. No. The machine erupted. The needles danced erratically across the paper. A frantic, jagged confession drawn in ink. The performance was over. The body does not know how to lie. After a few more questions, each one met with a similar, violent physiological response. The examiner took off the sensors. The test was over. He let Chris sit in the crushing silence for a long time. Then he looked him directly in the eye, his voice no longer neutral but heavy with the weight of certainty. Polygraph examiner, Chris, we're done. You failed this test, and I don't mean you just failed it. I have been doing this for a very long time. This is a catastrophic, monumental failure. The charts are screaming that you are lying about everything related to your family's disappearance. The wall that Chris Watts had so carefully constructed came down, not in a flood of tears, but in a quiet, chilling crumble. He put his head in his hands. But what came next was not the whole truth. It was a new performance, a desperate final attempt to salvage some part of his shattered self-image. He began to confess, but he confessed to a lie, a carefully constructed narrative designed to make him the victim. He asked to speak to his father. And to him, in a low, broken voice, he spun a story of horrific betrayal. Chris Watts, voice cracking, choked with false emotion. I came home, and I saw her on the baby monitor. I saw her with Celeste. She was hurting her, and then I saw Bella. She was already blue, and I snapped. I went into a rage. I killed her, Dad. After what she did, I killed her. It was a shocking, gut-wrenching story. A story of a loving father who, upon witnessing an unspeakable act committed by his wife against their children, was driven to murder in a fit of righteous fury. It was a confession, but it was also a justification. It painted him not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a tragic hero, a man broken by his wife's monstrous act. It was a horrific yet strangely sympathetic narrative, and it was a complete calculated fabrication, designed to hide a truth that was, impossibly, even worse. Why this specific lie? Why paint Shanann as the monster? Because this story, as terrible as it was, still allowed him to be the father who loved his children. It was a lie constructed to protect himself from admitting to the one act so inhuman, so monstrous, that it placed him beyond all hope of redemption. What was the one truth he was still so desperate to hide? His confession was a strategic masterpiece of deception. By painting Shanann as a monster who had harmed their children, Chris Watts was attempting to execute a final, twisted act of control. He was not only murdering his wife, he was murdering her memory, trying to poison her legacy with a lie so monstrous it was almost believable. This narrative, as shocking as it was, served a specific psychological purpose. It was a lie constructed to salvage his own identity. It allowed him to cling to the one role he was not yet willing to surrender. The role of the loving father, driven to a single, terrible act by an unbearable tragedy. My analysis of this false confession is that it was not a spontaneous breakdown. It was a pre-calculated fallback plan. In that moment, Chris was no longer trying to prove his innocence. He was trying to mitigate his guilt. The story positioned him not as the architect of his family's destruction, but as a reactor, a victim of his wife's sudden, inexplicable violence. It was a plea for a lesser form of condemnation, an attempt to grasp at some sliver of human sympathy in the face of his own inhumanity. The police at that moment had no forensic evidence to contradict his story. They had a confession to one murder, and for a homicide investigation, that is a monumental breakthrough. Their primary goal now shifted from eliciting a confession to recovering the bodies. Playing along with his narrative, they put him in a car. He had agreed to lead them to where he had buried his wife, to the place where, in his story, this terrible tragedy had reached its conclusion. The drive that followed was a surreal, somber journey into the vast, empty plains of rural Colorado. They drove for over an hour to a remote oil and gas field owned by Anadarko Petroleum, the company Chris worked for. It was an industrial wasteland, a place of stark mechanical beauty and profound isolation. The landscape was dotted with the monolithic shapes of oil storage tanks, standing like silent metallic tombstones against the endless sky. As they drove, Chris, now in the role of the grieving, traumatized husband, recounted the details of his fabricated story. Chris Watts, voice low, broken from police car recording. I couldn't believe what I was seeing on the monitor. I can still hear Bella asking, what's wrong with Mommy? I lost my mind. I wrapped her in a sheet, and I put her in the back of my truck. Investigator, voice calm, professional. And the girls, Chris? Where were the girls then? Chris Watts. They were in the back seat. In their car seats. I had to get away from the house, listen to the details. He is including the children in his journey to the burial site. This is the crucial, fatal flaw in his perfect lie. In the story he has constructed, the children are already dead, victims of their mother. His only crime, in his version, is the disposal of his wife's body. When they arrived at the desolate oil field, he led them to a patch of freshly turned earth at the base of a small hill. He pointed. "She's right there," he said. Based on his story, this should have been the end. This should have been the location of a single tragic grave. But the investigators, now surveying the scene, were confronted with a chilling logistical question that his story could not answer. Standing before them were two massive 40-foot-tall oil tanks. Their hatches at the top, small circular openings barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. He had buried his wife here, but if his story was true, if he had brought his deceased children with him in the back seat, why had he driven to this specific, bizarre location? What purpose did these giant oil tanks serve? The lie he had so carefully constructed to protect himself was about to be dismantled, not by a confession, but by the simple, horrifying geography of the crime scene he himself had chosen. The investigators on that desolate oil field were standing at the edge of an abyss. Chris Watts' story, the story of a father snapping in a fit of rage, was a terrible one. But the geography of the crime scene was telling them a different, far more sinister story. A story that involved a level of cold, methodical planning that his narrative of spontaneous rage simply could not explain. The grim work had to begin. Following Chris's direction, a recovery team began to excavate the shallow grave. What they found confirmed the first part of his confession. It was Shanann. She had been wrapped in a sheet from their bed, a final, grotesque mockery of the intimacy they had once shared. But the discovery of his wife's body only amplified the investigators' dread. They turned their attention to the two monolithic oil tanks that loomed over the scene. An oil and gas worker was called in to unseal the heavy, circular hatches at the top, known in the industry as thief hatches. As the first hatch was opened, a wave of toxic fumes and the overpowering stench of crude oil filled the air. The workers, equipped with specialized breathing apparatus, peered into the darkness below. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. Then a voice, strained and hollow, cut through the silence. Recovery worker, voice muffled by a mask. I see something. Oh my God, I see her. Inside that tank, submerged in the thick, black sludge, was the small body of a child. It was Bella Watts. Not long after, in the second tank, they found her sister, 3-year-old Celeste. The lie was not just broken, it was annihilated. His story of a spontaneous, rage-fueled act had been meticulously crafted to hide this single, unforgivable truth. He had not just killed his wife. He had driven for over an hour with his 2 living, breathing daughters in the back of his truck to the place where he had just buried their mother, only to then end their lives in the most calculated and horrific way imaginable. The forensic evidence that followed was the final, scientific nail in the coffin of his deception. Dr. Alana Vega, narrator. The autopsies were definitive. Shanann had not been killed in a struggle, as Chris claimed. The cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation, but the most damning evidence came from the children. There were no signs of the violence Chris had described. The autopsy for both Bella and Celeste determined their cause of death was asphyxiation by smothering. They had been killed deliberately, quietly, intimately. His story of seeing them blue on the baby monitor was a complete fabrication. When the investigators confronted Chris with this irrefutable forensic proof, the final mask fell away. There were no more stories. There were no more tears. There was only the cold, flat, and horrifying truth. In a new confession, stripped of all emotion and performance, he finally recounted the real events of that morning. He told them how he had killed Shanann in their bed, after she had confronted him about his affair. He told them how Bella had walked in afterwards, asking what was wrong with her mommy. He told them how he had wrapped Shanann's body in a sheet, loaded it into his truck, and then put his 2 daughters, still alive, still in their pajamas, into the back seat for their final, terrifying car ride. He recounted the drive to the oil field, a journey where his children sat just feet away from their mother's dead body. And then he described in a chilling monotone how he had smothered Celeste with her favorite blanket in the back seat as her sister Bella watched. And then how he had done the same to Bella. The what had finally been answered in all its sickening detail. The story of the grieving father had been replaced by the reality of a family annihilator, a monster of almost incomprehensible selfishness and cruelty. But as the world reeled from the sheer brutality of his actions, the one question that remained was a gaping black hole at the center of the case. The how was now known, but the why remained a mystery. What could possibly motivate a man to not just leave his family, but to erase them from the face of the earth? To understand that, investigators had to uncover a secret life he had kept completely hidden. A life that didn't exist in any of Shanann's sunny Facebook posts. A life that revolved around one person, a woman named Nicole Kessinger. The why was a black hole at the center of the case, an abyss of motive that seemed to defy all rational explanation. But every black hole has a source of gravity, an unseen force that pulls everything into it. For Chris Watts, that force had a name, Nicole Kessinger. She was his co-worker at Anadarko Petroleum, an intelligent, independent woman with whom he had begun a secret, passionate affair just weeks before the murders. She represented everything his life with Shanann was not. She was a new life, a clean slate, a future unwritten by Facebook posts and unburdened by debt or obligation. To understand the motive, my team and I gained access to thousands of text messages and phone records exchanged between Chris and Nicole in that fateful summer. Reading them is like watching a slow-motion car crash. It's a portrait of a man methodically constructing a new life on a foundation of lies. Chris Watts, voice as if from a text message. Can't stop thinking about you. You're the best thing that's happened to me in a long time. Nickel Kessinger, voice responding text. You too. I just wish things weren't so complicated with your situation. Chris Watts, text. They're not. I told you we're separating. It's mutual. We're just finalizing the details. The house, the finances. It'll be over soon. He told her he was at the end of a divorce, not at the beginning of a new family. He told her Shanann had accepted the separation. He created a fictional reality for Nickel, a reality where he was an available, soon-to-be single man, free to start over. She was not just his lover. She was his audience for his greatest performance of deception. While he was texting her about their future, he was at home, playing the part of the doting husband, rubbing Shanann's pregnant belly. This is where my analysis diverges from the simple narrative of a man having an affair. The affair was the catalyst, but it was not the core disease. To understand the why, we must re-examine our first rule, the rule of the perfect family. For years, this rule had been a mask Chris wore. But in the summer of 2018, it was no longer a mask. It had become a cage. The perfect house was a cage of debt. The two beautiful daughters were a cage of responsibility. The impending third child, a son he had told Shanann he wanted, was the final inescapable bar on that cage. The perfect life she had so meticulously broadcast to the world had become his prison. Nickel Kessinger was not just a woman. She was the key to a life outside that prison. But a man like Chris Watts, a man obsessed with image and the perception of others, could not simply walk out of the cage. Divorce is messy. It's a public declaration of failure. It tarnishes the perfect image. It involves custody battles, financial ruin, and social judgment. It is, in short, an imperfect solution. Erasure, however, is clean. A tragedy, on the other hand, garners sympathy. A man who tragically loses his entire family is not a failure. He is a victim. He is an object of pity, free to start his life over with a clean slate, unburdened by the messy realities of a failed marriage. The affair provided the motive. But the affair, as powerful as it was, only explains the why. It doesn't explain the horrifying, methodical how. It doesn't explain the cold, calculated efficiency of the act. It doesn't explain a man who can look his children in the eye, kill them, and then calmly hide their bodies in tanks of crude oil. The answer to that wasn't in the loving text messages he sent to Nickel. It was in the chillingly detached words he was typing into his Google search bar in the weeks leading up to the murders. What does a man on the verge of a spontaneous act of passion search for online? The answer would prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was not a crime of passion. This was an execution. The affair with Nickel Kessinger explained the why. It provided the motive, the gravitational pull towards a new life. But it did not explain the how. It did not explain the cold, methodical precision of a man who could look his children in the eye, kill them, and then dispose of their bodies with the detached efficiency of a man taking out the trash. The answer to that question was not found in the loving text messages he sent to his mistress. It was found in the chilling digital breadcrumbs he left behind in the weeks leading up to the murders. A trail that led directly into the darkest corners of his Google search history. A person's search history is the closest thing we have to a map of their unvarnished thoughts. It is a private conversation with the world, a place where we ask the questions we would never dare to ask out loud. And in the summer of 2018, while Chris Watts was still playing the part of the doting husband, his Google searches were painting a portrait of a man not just contemplating a new life, but actively researching the demolition of his old one. The searches began with finance. The cold calculus of separation. Dr. Alana Vega, narrator. Investigators found searches for Shanann Watts' net worth and how much is a 30-year mortgage. He was not a man in the throes of a passionate, uncontrollable affair. He was an administrator, calculating the cost of his exit strategy. But then the searches turned more personal, more psychological, revealing a man trying to justify his own betrayal while still living inside of it. He searched for vacation spots, looking up prices for a weekend getaway to Aspen with Nickel. He did this while Shanann was at home, pregnant with his child. The level of dissociation is staggering. He was living so completely in his fantasy future that the present had become an inconvenience to be managed. But it's the searches. From the final weeks that cross the line from infidelity into the realm of premeditation. They are not the searches of a man planning a divorce. They are the searches of a man planning an erasure. On the same week that Shanann was away on her final business trip, the week she was sending desperate texts to her friends about his coldness, Chris was searching for the lyrics to the Metallica song, Battery. The lyrics are about domination and control. He was building his own psychological soundtrack. Then came the search that, in my analysis, is the true smoking gun. While his pregnant wife was in another state, he Googled, "What are the effects of oxycodone on a fetus?" Let that sink in. This is not a crime of passion. This is not a man who snapped. This is a man researching poisons. This is the cold, methodical thought process of someone exploring options, of someone contemplating not just a departure but a quiet, permanent solution to a problem he no longer wished to manage. This digital footprint completely dismantles the narrative of a man driven to rage. It proves without a shadow of a doubt that the murders of his family were the result of a deliberate, calculated decision. He had weighed his options. He had looked at the messy, complicated, and public failure of a divorce, and he had compared it to the clean, tragic, and sympathy-garnering freedom of a widower. And he had made his choice. The evidence seemed overwhelming, the case logically closed. We had the motive, a new life with a new woman. We had the proof of premeditation, a history of chillingly specific Google searches. The legal story was, for all intents and purposes, complete. But the human story, the story of what happened in those final, terrible moments, was not. Months after his conviction, in a final, 5-hour-long confession from prison, Chris revealed a detail so harrowing, a detail about his daughter Bella's last moments, that it forces us to re-examine everything we thought we knew about the true depth of the monster behind the mask. What were his daughter's final heartbreaking words? And what did they reveal about the man who had erased his own soul long before he erased his family? The Google searches proved premeditation, but the human heart struggles to comprehend the act itself. To kill one's own children? For years, the world was left to grapple with the how, a question so monstrous it seemed beyond all human understanding. The answer, when it finally came, was more chilling than any of us could have imagined. It came from a final 5-hour confession Chris gave to investigators from a Wisconsin prison, months after he had been sentenced. This was not a confession for a plea deal, or a performance for a camera. This was the unvarnished truth told in the flat, detached monotone of a man recounting a series of logistical problems he had solved. He began by describing the final argument with Shanann after she returned from her trip. He told her the marriage was over. He confessed to his affair, and then, in his own words, she told him he would never see his children again. In that moment, he said, he snapped. He strangled his wife in their bed. But what followed was not a story of passion. It was a story of process. The horror of his next actions is in their quiet, methodical coldness. He described how his 4-year-old daughter, Bella, walked into the room just moments after he had killed her mother. She saw her mother's body wrapped in a sheet on the floor. Chris Watts, voice flat, monotone from confession tape. Bella, she was in her pink pajamas. She had a blanket with her. She looked at me and she asked, "What's wrong with Mommy?" My analysis of this moment is that this was the point of no return. In his mind, his daughter was now a witness, a loose end. He told investigators how he carried his wife's body down the stairs and loaded it into his truck. And then he did the unthinkable. He put his 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, still alive, still confused, into the back seat of that same truck, and began the hour-long drive to the oil field. The journey itself is an abyss of narcissism. For over an hour, he drove with his living children, knowing their fate while their mother's body lay just feet away from them. When they arrived, he pulled Shanann's body from the truck and buried her in a shallow grave. The girls watched. Then he turned to his youngest daughter, 3-year-old Celeste, who he called Cece. He took her favorite blue blanket. Chris Watts, confession tape. I took Cece's blanket, and I put it over her head and I smothered her. Then I took her out of the truck and I put her in the tank, but he was not alone. Bella, his 4-year-old, had watched him do it. She had watched her father murder her little sister. As he walked back to the truck, she was waiting for him, her voice small and terrified. It is her final, heartbreaking words that reveal the true depth of the monster. Chris Watts, confession tape. She asked me, "Is the same thing going to happen to me as Cece?" And I'm not sure what I even said. I don't even want to say it. Just that she said it. "Daddy, no." He said she fought back. The mask was not just gone. It was obliterated. There was no heartbroken father. No man who had snapped. There was only a creature of pure selfish calculation. A man who saw his own children not as human beings to be loved, but as inconveniences to be removed. He was a problem solver, and his family was the final problem. The last shred of humanity had been extinguished. With this final confession, the monster was fully revealed, the story seemingly complete. But one final, nagging question remains. A ghost in the machine of this case that armchair detectives and investigators alike have never been able to fully put to rest. Chris Watts acted alone. That is the official story. But what did his mistress, Nicole Kessinger, really know? The woman who claimed she knew nothing, yet whose phone records showed a series of deleted, highly suspicious Google searches in the days surrounding the murders. Did she have any idea what was about to happen? With Chris Watts's final confession, the legal case was slammed shut. The monster had a face, a motive, and a life sentence. But in the sprawling, decentralized world of the internet, the story was far from over. One ghost remained in the machine, a figure of intense speculation and controversy whose true role in the tragedy has been debated ever since. Nicole Kessinger. To the police, she was officially a witness, another victim of Chris's intricate web of lies. Her story was consistent and, on the surface, compelling. She had met a charming man who told her he was in the final stages of a mutual, amicable separation. She had, she claimed, no idea that Shanann was pregnant, and no idea that he was capable of violence. When she saw him on the news pleading for his family's return, she was horrified, realizing the man she thought she knew was a complete fabrication. In her own words to investigators, she was unequivocal. Nicole Kessinger, voice calm but firm from an interview transcript. "He's a liar. He lied about everything. If I had known any of this, any of it, I never would have gotten involved with him. I never would have let it go this far." The police investigated her thoroughly. They found no direct evidence of her involvement in the planning or execution of the murders. Legally, she was cleared. But for the millions of armchair detectives who were now obsessively dissecting every detail of the case online, she was not a victim. She was the central mystery, and the more they dug, the more unsettling questions they found. The primary source of this suspicion was her own digital footprint, a trail of deleted data that seemed to contradict her story of a woman completely in the dark. Investigators were able to recover a portion of her Google search history from the days surrounding the murders. And the search terms were, to put it mildly, deeply disturbing. Dr. Alana Vega, narrator. While Shanann and her daughters were still officially missing, and the world was praying for their safe return, Nicole Kessinger was searching online for topics like Shanann Watts. But the searches didn't stop there. She also Googled the phrase, "marrying your mistress." And then came the most damning search of all, a search that revealed a chilling level of self-interest at a time of supposed national tragedy. She Googled the net worth of Amber Frey, the mistress of another notorious family annihilator, Scott Peterson. She then searched for, "How much is Amber Frey getting for her book deal?" These are not the searches of a woman simply caught in the crossfire. They are the searches of a woman contemplating her future, her narrative, and her potential financial gain, in the wake of a crime she claimed to know nothing about. When confronted with this, she claimed she was just scared and trying to understand what happens in these situations. But the public wasn't buying it. Then there was the matter of the deleted data. Immediately after the murders, she had systematically deleted all of her text messages, call logs, and photos related to Chris Watts from her phone. To investigators, this could be interpreted as the act of a terrified woman trying to distance herself from a monster. To the court of public opinion, it was the act of someone destroying evidence. My analysis of the public's obsession with Kessinger is rooted in a deep psychological need. The idea that a seemingly normal man like Chris Watts could single-handedly, with no outside influence, decide to annihilate his entire family is almost too much for the human psyche to bear. It is, in a strange way, more comforting to believe in a co-conspirator, a femme fatale, a second villain who helped push him over the edge. Kessinger became the repository for all the unanswered questions, for the parts of the story that still didn't make sense. While the legal system had its answer, closing the book on her involvement, the court of public opinion was just getting started. It was this intense, global, and digitally fueled investigation into the other woman that transformed the Chris Watts case from a local tragedy into something the world had never seen before. The first great trial by social media. But what happens when millions of amateur detectives have access to every piece of evidence? Every interview, every frame of body cam footage? And how did their digital obsession change the very nature of true crime forever? The legal story of Chris Watts ended with a life sentence, but the cultural story was just beginning. The case became a global obsession for a reason that had little to do with the crime itself, and everything to do with us, the audience. It marked a permanent shift in how we interact with true crime, transforming millions of passive viewers into active, obsessive digital investigators. This was not just a case we watched, it was a case we inhabited. Never before had a tragedy unfolded with such radical, near-total transparency. The phenomenon was fueled by a perfect storm of information. On one side, you had Shanann's digital life. Her prolific Facebook presence provided an almost minute-by-minute chronicle of her family's final years. A constant stream of videos, photos, and heartfelt posts. The public didn't just have a victim's name. They had her voice, her personality, her dreams. They had an unprecedented before picture, a reality show that had ended in an unthinkable finale. On the other side, in an act of almost unbelievable transparency, the Frederick Police Department released the entire case file to the public. The discovery documents, thousands of pages of text messages, police reports, and witness interviews, and most critically, hours upon hours of raw, unfiltered video. The body cam footage from the initial welfare check, the tense conversation in the neighbor's living room, and the full, unedited interrogation and confession tapes. With this unprecedented access, a new kind of investigator was born, the armchair detective. YouTube channels dedicated entire series to analyzing every frame of Chris's body language during that first porch interview. Reddit forums like our Chris Watts became collaborative war rooms, where users created timelines, transcribed text messages, and debated theories with an intensity that rivaled the official investigation. TikTok creators made viral videos breaking down the subtle tells of a psychopath, using Chris's blank, emotionless face as their primary text. My analysis of this phenomenon is that it was a direct and powerful reaction to the rule of the perfect family. The public had been shown a flawless performance, and when that performance was revealed to be a monstrous lie, they felt a deep cultural need to expose it, to find every crack in the facade they had been sold. It was a collective act of digital rebellion against the curated perfection of the social media age. This case provided a sense of solvability that older, more mysterious cases lacked. The evidence was fresh, it was digital, and it was accessible to everyone. People felt they could contribute, that their analysis mattered. They weren't just watching a documentary. They were participating in a global, real-time autopsy of a family, a marriage, and a murder. They were looking for the clues the police might have missed, the lies hidden between the lines of a text message. This digital obsession changed the very nature of true crime forever. It was no longer a story told to us by the evening news or a polished documentary. It was a raw data set, and we, the public, became co-authors of the narrative. We were no longer just the audience. We were the jury, the psychologists, and the detectives. The case of Chris Watts democratized criminal investigation, for better or for worse, blurring the lines between observer and participant in a way the world had never seen before. The world became experts in spotting the lies of Chris Watts. We learned the tells of a psychopath. We deconstructed his mask with forensic precision, exposing the monster underneath. But this leads to a final, more uncomfortable question. In our obsession with the monster's performance, what did we learn about the ones we create for ourselves every single day? So where does this leave us? It leaves us in the digital rubble of a family that existed more on a screen than in reality. It leaves us with the unsettling knowledge that the man who committed one of the most monstrous acts in modern history looked, for all the world, like a perfect husband and father. Chris Watts is not an anomaly. He is an extreme, horrifying product of a rule we have all, in some small way, agreed to follow. The rule of the perfect family, the relentless pressure to perform a flawless life for a digital audience, was the mask he wore, but it was also his prison. In my analysis, this rule is more dangerous than simple deception. It is a form of social currency that demands a flawless exterior, no matter how rotten the foundation becomes. For Chris Watts, the foundation was not just cracked. It was a void. He wasn't just hiding an affair. He was hiding a complete psychic collapse. He was hiding the fact that there was nothing left inside. He was a hollow man, and the weight of the performance had become unbearable. In his final, 5-hour confession from prison, when investigators pressed him on what he was thinking, what he was feeling as he took his daughter's lives, he gave the most honest and the most terrifying answer of all. Chris Watts, voice flat, monotone from confession tape. I didn't feel anything. There it is. The truth behind the performance. Not rage, not passion, not even hatred. Just nothing. A complete absence of empathy. The persona he had perfected for the cameras and for Facebook had consumed the man, leaving behind only an empty shell that saw his own children as logistical problems to be solved. He had become so disconnected from his own humanity that erasing his family felt like deleting old files to free up space for a new life. His story is a dark mirror held up to our digital age. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. We, the public, became experts at deconstructing his lies after the fact. We analyzed his body language, his crocodile tears, his empty words, and we felt a sense of collective satisfaction at seeing through his performance. But are we as adept at seeing the smaller, quieter cracks in the facades all around us every day? The friend whose posts are a little too perfect after a public breakup. The family member who broadcasts an idyllic vacation while drowning in secret debt. The colleague who boasts of a promotion while their hands tremble slightly from anxiety. The ultimate lesson from the Watts family tragedy is not about the monster we can see, but about the invisible cracks we choose to ignore. It is a story about the devastating difference between a perfect picture and a true person. So the final question is not about Chris Watts. It is about us. In our endless scroll through a world of flawless images, have we lost the ability to see the people who are quietly, desperately falling apart right in front of us?